People of Western Europe. A landing was made this morning on the coast of France by troops of the Allied Expeditionary Force.
As well as I can.
This landing is part of the concerted United Nations plan for the liberation of Europe, made in conjunction with our great Russian allies.
You know, the weather out here this evening makes me think of D-Day. It was about like that when we landed early that morning. I very much enjoyed being at Canute this year to see the reenactment of the D-Day invasion. It brought back a lot of memories to me, some very sad, and some I enjoyed. There are only a few of us D-Day veterans alive today. There are only 2 in my outfit of 185 men. On that morning, only 12 could move forward. The rest was killed or wounded. To tell you a little bit about myself, I was born in Haydenville, Ohio, in Hocking County, with the Hocking River running between 2 large hills. And the water flowing south to the Muskingum River, to Ohio, the Mississippi, and out to sea. I studied pharmacy and pre-med at Ohio State till war broke out. I worked at the Standard Oil service station on Broad Monroe, working myself through college. I worked all night on June the 6th, 1941. I left around 6 o'clock that morning and rode the bus to 229 East 11th Avenue, where I went to bed immediately. That evening I had to go back to work. I couldn't understand why everything was so quiet. When I reached my place where I was working at the Standard Oil service station, I noticed that everybody that worked there was there. I could not understand. I had not heard anything yet. When I went in, they turned the radio off. I said, "What's wrong?" "I haven't heard anything." And then they told me about Pearl Harbor being bombed. I looked at Matt Maynard, the manager of the station, and I said, "Matt, I'm through working here." I left, went back to my room, and I called my sister. I told her to come back tomorrow and pick up all my books and sell them. She was working her way through cosmetology school in Columbus, Ohio, and I was helping her the best I could. She left one book for me, which I requested, my cosmetology book. That afternoon, on the 8th, I went down and enlisted at Fort Hays. They gave me 2 days leave to handle my personal things. I went back to my mother's and told them what I had done, and my stepfather, who was the most wonderful person in the world. When I left there, I put my arms around my stepfather and said, "You're the best daddy in all the world." And I can remember tears rolling down his face. That was the last I ever saw my stepfather alive. I went back to Fort Hays. I had called my girlfriend Ruthie here. And I told her what I had done. And then I was leaving on Wednesday by train. And as far as I knew, it was to Camp Roberts, California. Ruthie met me at the station. I'll never forget it. It was the most beautiful experience I ever had, because there was other things involved. I carried a picture of her through all the war. If I missed a few things, it's because I concentrating too much. Well, anyway, I took my basic training in combat intelligence in California. Why would they put me in combat intelligence when I had experience already in the medical? That's the way the Army works. After my basic training, I requested to be transferred to the hospital. I was transferred to the hospital. And I worked in the laboratory. They were doing serology, bacteriology, and all that stuff. I'll never forget, I had been taking care of a soldier. Urinalysis, blood, and everything. And it looked as though he had appendicitis. So that evening I was working and I had to do the last test on him. And Captain Ward came in. He said, we need a donor. I knew what type of blood this soldier had. So I go out in the orderly room and I said, whose type? A or B? Because they'd get a quart of milk in 3 days off. I had my donor. I ran across match on him, which I had no business ever doing. But the Captain Ward said, I don't have time for anything else. I asked him to look at the results. He says, I don't have time. How do they look? I said, they look all right to me. I was about ready to go over the hill, because had I made a mistake, it would have killed him instantly. The next morning, when I went in, Colonel Cranville said, you have no business doing what you did last night. That is supposed to be a licensed technician that does that work. And just as he was getting me all kinds of heck, here come Captain Ward in with a 2.5-gallon bucket of guts. He had cut off. Blood had cut off in his intestines. Well, that relieved me. Several months later, I was in Fort Sill, Oklahoma. From there, I received special orders after being here for about 3 or 4 months. And I was heading east towards Ohio that I hadn't seen for several months. When I went through Columbus, I wanted to get off of that train so bad to see Ruthie. But nevertheless, I continued on. I can't speak anymore. Oh, my destination was in Dendown Gap. Pennsylvania. I was traveling under special orders. I had my own book. What do they call that? Service record. I had my own service record. And I knew what was in that too. Then I was sent. Ruthie and I, no one even knew I was around. But I was assigned to a company. And on the weekend, I would just leave the camp, bum home to Columbus, Ohio, and spend a couple of days with Ruthie and back. They didn't even know I was gone. Now this went on for some time. Then I called Ruthie and I said, Ruthie, I'm going to get my blood test this week. You get yours, and we'll be married Saturday. Isn't that some way to propose to me?
That's the word.
Well, I thought I'd better get a pass. So I went into Lieutenant Soskin and I said, Lieutenant Soskin, I need a 3-day pass. He said, the best I can give you is the 2-day pass. He said, you make them out and I'll sign them. So I made out one, April the 1st to April the 2nd. And the second one I made out was April the 2nd to April the 3rd. He signed them without even looking. Well, I arrived on that Saturday. Ruthie and we went up to the courthouse to get our marriage license. They wouldn't accept my blood test from Pennsylvania. I had half hour to get a blood test. And I told that guy, I said, you stay here till I get back. I went up to Fort Hays in the medical section, and it was a sergeant there. I had made my medical. I said, I need 1 mile. I was back in 15 minutes. I bet that guy thought that was the fastest blood test he ever did. Nevertheless, we left, and we were married in Springfield, Ohio, on April 3rd, 1943. 2 days later, I was on my way overseas. I went to New York, shipped to New York, and there I was on the Queen Elizabeth. The Queen Mary with some of the 29th divisions had already left. And I was following them up with a lot of the other 29th divisions on the Queen Elizabeth. I landed in Glasgow, Scotland, and from there I traveled to Tidworth Barracks outside of London where the division was stationed. After several days there, I was transferred to the 116th Infantry Regiment of the 29th Division. I trained there in England for over a year at Slapton Sands. It was a beach similar to Omaha Beach, but we had no idea what we were doing. Our last rehearsal at Slapton Sands was a dress rehearsal with our ODs on. We knew that was it, what was going to happen. going to ask you, after I talk a little bit about my experience on D-Day, I'm going to ask you a question. You can ask me later on. But I'm going to ask you all a question here this morning. Have you ever seen, how many of you have ever seen Saving Private Ryan? I saw Private Ryan for the first time. I left shortly after starting. Having been there on D-Day, left me with a sick feeling. Several weeks later, I returned to see Saving Private Ryan. When I reached home, it was a little after midnight. And as I laid down to rest, I don't know whether I had a nightmare or a dream, that I was back in France. And I took I took my little grandson with me, and we visited places where I hadn't been many years before. Omaha Beach, St. Lo, Cherbourg, Aachen, and the Buchenwald concentration camp where the crematories still seem warm. And then all of a sudden, we were walking among crosses at Kuwilson, American Cemetery. As we walked along, I knelt down and wiped the dust off the face of the cross so the name would be more legible to my eyes. My grandson said, "Who's that?" I said, "A friend of mine." As we continued walking along, I knelt down again, and my grandson said, "Who's that?" I said, "Another friend of mine." And then as we continued walking among the crosses, I remembered our last breakfast, when the general came in and he said, "I want you to look at the one on your left and the one on your right. After today, you may never see them again." Subconsciously, as I was walking along, was I looking for the one on my left and the one on my right? My grandson started running. I couldn't keep up. Time had taken over my youth, and I moved very slowly. And when I looked up, I saw a large cross. It was so large that it casted a shadow over all the little crosses in the field, like a sunset in the evening. And I saw my grandson wiping the dust off the face of that cross. He could not find the name upon that cross. But when he looked up, he was filled with great excitement. He yelled, "Who's that? Who's that?" So loud that it echoed through the fields. "Who's that? Who's that?" I took him by the hand and we sat down at the foot of the cross. And I told him about Jesus being crucified upon the cross. Amen. And that there was no grave that can hold him. And on the third day he arose to be with his heavenly Father. Now, do you see the difference? Those who lie beneath those little crosses have given us an earthly freedom, where Jesus has given us an eternal freedom. Amen. Someday I would like to go back and find the names of the one on my left and the one on my right that I left behind that breakfast morning. Midnight had come and gone. It was now early in the morning of June the 6th, 1944. Unable to sleep, I stood against the railing of a transport ship that was pushing through the darkness. As I stood there looking into the deep darkness, a fellow soldier came and stood beside me. Although we wore the same uniform and stood on the same deck, this soldier was unknown to me. We did not speak a word. We just stared into the darkness and again, without speaking, turned and looked at each other. I did not know what was on his mind, and he did not know what was on mine. We looked at each other that moment, then turned and gazed into the darkness again. As we stood there, we could hear airplanes flying overhead. From the sound, they were headed to France or Germany to deliver their cargo to unknown targets. We had heard that familiar sound before, as the pilots and crew were flying into hellish gunfire of anti-aircraft weapons. Those on the ship that night had no idea we would be heading into Eagle Hellfire. In those pre-dawn hours of the sky, and as some soldiers huddled together trying to keep away with a chill and get some precious sleep. Others were walking around like my railway at night, not saying a word, just walking and looking. It was like we were all in a theater, waiting for the instant the show would begin. I looked deep into the waters. And the tips of the waves sparkled in the moon, and the starlight like fireflies flying in the countries we were back in. Those fireflies would be calling to their mates, and now I was thinking of my wife.
Wow.
Then in an instant, the quiet was broken by the clicking of boots on the steel deck and the clicking of live shells being loaded into rifles. At that moment, we all knew that this was not a training exercise, but we had to accomplish the doomsday that was to follow. Once again, I looked at the unknown soldier standing next to me at the rail. We both had a duty to do, and each would act according to his separate way. As we walked away, I wondered who he was and if I would ever meet him again. I turned towards the darkness to see landing craft approaching the side of the ship. As the landing craft neared, the names were being called as the conductor was calling passengers on a train. Instead, we were being called to our duty and fate. I went as my name was called to another area of the railing, this time to climb down a rope ladder to the landing craft. The calm sea with the sparkling waves was now 4 to 5 feet that were making the landing craft bob up and down. Our landing craft circled the transport mothership as a duckling circles its mouth. As day was breaking, I knew we were not alone. Then the greatest armada in the history was before my eyes. There were hundreds of similarly loaded landing craft as far as the eye could see, and our conductors yelled, "All aboard." We were on our way to fulfill our destiny. We rode the waves as a great sea of men. We break with breast, and the waves would break and splash our faces. But we could not turn back. It seemed like an eternity or an instant. But there we were. The door was open, and we were jumping out. We were jumping out into 4 to 5 feet water. Bullets and shells were bursting everywhere. Many jumped in the water that day, never touched dry ground. And those that did never saw the sunrise the next morning. It was chaos in the bowels of hell, and it continued through the day. Then I saw the unknown soldier who stood beside me at the rail. He was lying upon the sand with his helmet still upon his head and his gun in his hand, with a smile frozen upon his face as though to say, I have helped to set them free. This dead American soldier was still unknown to me, but known to God only. When I jumped into the water that morning, I had two cardboard canisters, about 6 or 8 inches around, with about 85-pound of medical supplies. And when I jumped into the water, I was like a blubber on a fishing pole. I was falling up and down. Those canisters. It didn't take me long to get rid of them. And then I got rid of them, I went under the water. The only thing that I carried with me that rest of that morning was around 200 morphine cigarettes in a pouch around my waist. As I walked along the beach, I